There was another story that I wanted to actually do last week too, and I was unable to do that back then in last week's episode. So I decided to bring it up with you guys this time. So this is an article from Politico, and it talks about how Elizabeth Warren was actually considering being Hillary Clinton's VP when she was obviously the nominee for the Democratic Party after that horribly rigged primary and against Bernie Sanders. And she wanted to be Hillary Clinton's VP. And she actually says she would have accepted the offer if Clinton would have given it to her. Now, reports have come out, and I think this is something that Kyle Kalinske said on his show when he covered this story, and he said that she was being considered, but people had said, like, hey, if you do this, if you go with Elizabeth Warren, who's too left wing and too far left, blah blah, if you do that, we're not going to endorse you or give you money as far as like donors and stuff. So this was coming from like the corporate donors and the Wall Street establishment stuff. People were telling her that because at this time in 2016, Elizabeth Warren was much more anti-Wall Street, anti-establishment. Right now, she's not as anti-establishment and anti-Wall Street as she used to be. Now, her policies may be like that, but she has a much more friendly rapport with Wall Street nowadays compared to back then. And they didn't want her to be chosen as VP, and that's why Hillary Clinton ended up being stupid enough to go with a fucking white guy like Tim Kaine, who's the senator from Virginia. Horrible choice. The guy he's got the personality of a fucking wet dish towel. So, and his policies are right wing basically. He's a right wing Democrat basically, and she's going with him is honestly not that surprising. And as Kyle said in his segment, he believes that she chose him because, and maybe reports came out, I believe that that she ended up going with Tim Kaine in 2016 because she saw that as like, oh, I have to go back to the center, right? I have to go back to choose somebody moderate. He's not even really moderate, but choose somebody moderate that's going to, appeal to those people in those red states, essentially, because he's Virginia. Virginia is a pretty red state. And so he decided to do that. She decided to do that because she knew that, like, she needed to please the donors. And if she went with anybody else, I mean, all the other choices, there was clearly a lot of choices back then, too, as well, as much as there is right now as well. But, she wanted to go the route that she thought was going to make her more popular among moderates instead of progressives. So, as usual, Democrats spit in the eye of the progressives, the progressive base, and don't give a shit about them. And they're probably going to do that this time, too, if it ends up being an establishment candidate that wins the nominee this time as well. So, that person, he or she, will definitely pick an establishment choice for VP. So let's read the article here. It's not too long. Just wanted to go through this and so you guys can get a better idea of exactly what went on. So this is from Politico. Excuse me. It says, Warren, I would have accepted a VP offer from Clinton. And let's see here. It says Elizabeth Warren would have accepted an offer from Hillary Clinton to become her running mate in 2016. The Massachusetts senator and 2020 White House hopeful said in a report published Thursday. Warren, who declined to launch her own presidential bid 2.5 years ago despite intense efforts by progressives to draft her, even received a, quote, full vetting for the vice presidential slot by Clinton's team and was interviewed at the candidate's Whitehaven mansion in Washington, according to Bloomberg Businessweek. Clinton quote, seriously weighed Warren as a potential running mate, the report states, and top aide Phil Brains wrote in a memo to his boss after their meeting. Quoting him here, it says, if a crystal ball said she wouldn't antagonize you for 4 years, it's hard to argue she isn't the most helpful for the next 4 months to get you elected. So I guess that's referring to Warren as not just, I guess, a surrogate, but also VP. Yeah, because they run essentially. So after the primary, they have 4 months where they're running in the general election. It says, asked whether she would have agreed to become Clinton's number 2 on the ticket, Warren responded yes. During the 2016 campaign, Warren controversially opted not to back Clinton's chief primary challenger, fellow liberal Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, and went on to endorse Clinton in June of that year after the former Secretary of State had secured enough delegates to capture her party's nomination. Clinton ultimately selected Virginia Senator Tim Kaine as her running mate. Warren and Sanders are currently competing in the 2020 Democratic presidential race, battling each other and roughly 24 other candidates, including the frontrunner, former Vice President Joseph Biden. The pair of progressive lawmakers consistently rank within the top 5 choices of primary voters, along with Biden, Kamala Harris, California Senator Kamala Harris, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana. Their fight for voters, aligned with the party's left flank, has the potential to dominate the second Democratic debate next week in Detroit, where they will stand beside each other at center stage on the first night of the forums. So that's really concerning, I get the idea of wanting to be a VP in general, and I think Kyle made this case on his thing, and he said, I don't know if he made it when he did this segment, about this issue, but he has said in the past that the idea of having a progressive voice in the room, in other words, in the case of VP, so a VP being, so the progressive being a VP for a more establishment type candidate. He thinks that's a good idea. Now, I can see that argument, and I can understand how somebody would say that, and it makes sense. But it's just so weird to have somebody being in cahoots with the likes of Hillary Clinton, especially a progressive. Anybody really. I mean, anybody, when you see anybody being in cahoots with Hillary Clinton, you're like, ugh. It just makes you sick to your stomach because it's Hillary Clinton. Same thing with Joe Biden and stuff like that too. So, but this, if anything, this just says more about Elizabeth Warren. The fact that she would take that pick, it's unfortunate because when you're the VP, you don't do you do the things that the president does not want to do, and this is something I famously got from this documentary I watched one time. It's this great show. It's called Frontline. It's on PBS. I have some of the DVDs where they cover really important issues regarding past presidential administrations and stuff. And one of the people that appeared on this episode of Frontline from 2007, it was a documentary about Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney, who, of course, was the VP to George W. Bush. And apparently Dick Cheney, when he was the VP going into being the VP, so it was before the inauguration, days before the inauguration happened to inaugurate, President Bush and George Bush and Dick Cheney into their respective positions. Dick Cheney had a meeting with former Vice President under George H.W. Bush, Dan Quayle. So Cheney met with Dan Quayle, and apparently, according to this person, his name is Barton Gellman, or Barton Gellman, I think is, I always say Gellman, but Barton Gellman. He's a very, very good writer, and he takes very strong stances on national security issues and, illegal surveillance, illegal spying and whatnot. So, and he's the author of a book that I have up here. It's titled Angler, the Cheney Vice Presidency, and it's a very, very good book from 2008 or 9. And but Gellman made the remark in his little kind of short kind of part when he appeared on that episode of Frontline, and he said that. He recounted that the conversation that Dan Quayle, former George H.W. Bush vice president, had with the incoming vice president, Dick Cheney, that, hey, listen, Dick, when you're the vice president, what you're doing is your job is boring. You're going to go out there and you're going to give speeches at events that that the president doesn't have time for. You're going to go to like funerals of dead soldiers. Sounds terrible. And, you're going to do all these things that the president doesn't have time for. He's got to go and handle all different kinds of issues and matters that, that are really important. And you're going to be his kind of like his lackey. You're going to be like his obviously his number two. Obviously that's as they refer to as number two. You're literally going to be his number two. You're going to be doing what he doesn't want to do. And apparently in that interview, in that meeting that Quayle had with Dick Cheney, according to Gelman, he said Dick Cheney told Dan Quayle, no, me and President Bush, me and George, we have a different agreement. And then, when you think about it like that, you're like, wow. And when you look at what the vice presidency of Dick Cheney was, and as Barton Gelman explains in his book, the vice presidency of Dick Cheney, as many people know, was one of very just completely overhauling the entire national security state and the national security platform of this country. In other words, whether it's under Republicans or Democrats, the existence of the United States in the war on terror, illegal surveillance, kind of moving the chess pieces around the chessboard and focusing on having a more powerful stance in the world where America, the United States, is the main superpower, and they have all the power, and they're the ones that run everything. They're the most powerful, as everybody says, the most powerful country on earth. This was the goal of Dick Cheney as vice president. And when he says, I have a different agreement with George W. Bush, this is what I wanted to do. This is what he wanted to do. But that's kind of the different point because I'm going off on a tangent here but I just thought that was a really interesting point. But it shows you that when you are the VP, though, you are not going to do the main things you're doing unless your superior, the president, tells you as VP unless you're going to be doing something, if you have a different agreement with him like Dick Cheney had, you're going to be doing the boring ass things that is not going to involve. You're not going to be the last person that's going to be involved in that conversation. That might be what's perceived as the role of the vice president. But honestly, in all honesty, I don't think that's the case. I think that's more of an illusion. I think that's something that the media, mainstream media in Washington and the establishment tries to tell you. They tried to tell you like, no, totally, like that the VP, he's totally like the other person that's in the room, and the president is always going to ask the advice of the VP and wonder what they're going to say. I just don't believe that. I don't think that's true. And I mean, again, unless you have a different agreement like Dick Cheney had with George W. Bush, I just don't see that being the case. Because I think the choice of the VP is something. It's a opportunistic way for that specific politician, that person that's running, to tell people like, oh, the person I'm choosing, this is what kind of policies I'm going to be pushing for because I'm choosing this person. In reality, that's not the case, because that person, again, doesn't have that much of a role. They're doing all the dirty work, essentially, all the boring ass shit that the president doesn't want to do. They're doing the work for them. So why would they be involved in all the policy conversations? I really highly doubt that. I don't think that's really true. And it's more of the perception of that person going towards that. It's symbolic, you know what I'm saying? It's something to make people think that this is what this person is going to do based on policy, when in my opinion, they're really not. And I mean, just listen, Barack Obama went with somebody. Obviously, he went with Joe Biden. Everybody thought that like Barack Obama was going to be this big progressive guy, and he really wasn't. Now, I don't think that was because of Joe Biden, and honestly, at the time, probably a lot of people thought Joe Biden was progressive too. That's the problem, but that didn't end up happening. So my point is that when you go with the politicians that people assume to be progressive or assume to be this or that, whatever they are, I don't know. Honestly, it seems like for Democrats, that's I mean, when they choose their vice presidents, honestly, they end up choosing horrible ones. I mean, look what Al Gore did. Al Gore went with Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman ended up being horrible. I mean, he just ended up being one of the worst politicians, even after he was chosen by Al Gore. Obviously, Al Gore won Florida he won not only Florida, he won the election by 500,000 votes, and that was one of obviously two presidential elections to feature involve the actual winner not being the winner based on the electoral vote. And obviously Hillary Clinton ended up winning the vote, the electoral the popular vote. Not the electoral vote, but the popular vote. She obviously ended up winning by 2.7 million votes over Trump. Gore, like I said, won it by roughly about 500,000 over George W. Bush, but he still ended up losing it. But I believe that if he had not chosen Joe Lieberman, if he had actually chosen a real, legitimate progressive again, as usual, if he had done that, then they would have actually won. Now, Joe Lieberman, yeah. So I mean, Al Gore would have probably been a very good president. I think we would have probably avoided 9/11 because we wouldn't have had. I don't think we would have had a president that would have been threatening, would have been pushing for, obviously the kind of imperialism and stuff that George W. Bush was pushing for. And I believe we would just be able to avoid it because, George W. Bush wanted to go to war. And I don't think Al Gore would have been on board with that as much. But you never know. But either way, he would have been a hell of a lot better than George W. Bush. And at the time, a lot of people are just like, God damn. That was just ridiculous. It was a ridiculous thing to have happen, where, this guy, you pick this guy that's he's just a right-wing prick, basically, and he ended up becoming an independent, and he ended up basically becoming the best friends with John McCain, and he ended up shilling for a lot of right-wing positions. He hated the public option, and back when Obama was pushing for it, he hated the idea of a legitimate progressive healthcare plan. So yeah, Joe Lieberman ended up being horrible. After that one, it was in 2004. John Kerry, he chose John Edwards, who wasn't that great. He ended up being like a fucking. What was he, cheating on his wife or something, and he was like an adulterer. Another one, among many other politicians. But yeah, Obama choosing Biden, it ended up being a decent choice for at the time, but he wasn't progressive like a lot of people claimed he was. Obama and Biden, both. They both ended up being right-wing, establishment types. And look what we ended up getting. We ended up getting Trump because Obama disappointed all the progressives with his centrism and his establishment ideas. And now we have to try and defeat him. We have to try and defeat Trump with an actual progressive this time instead of going with another establishment type like Biden, Kamala Harris, or whatever, Pete Buttigieg, all these people, we can't have these choices. These are not the right choices. And honestly, ultimately, I don't think Elizabeth Warren is the right choice either, because I think she's way too much of an opportunist. I've said this before. She's way too opportunist. She's way too, apparently all of a sudden friendly with the Wall Street types and stuff. And I don't know. I mean, now we find out she wanted to be Hillary Clinton's VP too. I mean, why would I want somebody like that? Why would I want somebody that would want to be the second in command to Hillary Clinton? That's just to me, that's another huge red flag for another non-Bernie Sanders or non-Tulsi Gabbard candidate. And I just can't accept that. I'm sorry.